afternoon, everybody. My name is Massimo Campello. I'm working for Supernova Labs out of Kuwait. Supernova Labs basically is an accelerator that provides advisory and consulting services to the three key players in this game, meaning the financial institutions, the fintechs, so the startups, and the investors. So contrary to what you see this morning with Nestolmo, we don't invest in the startups, but we provide these services. My point today is to discuss about how fintech and banks can collaborate together in this field and in the game of the cashless challenge. Of course, through the potential threats and opportunities that are at the moment present. So we will see quickly three key messages. One is just to have a look to what's going on in the big techs. Second, what's going on with the fintech world. And finally, how fintech and banks can cooperate together. Let's start from this. Basically, this picture summarizes what was the start of everything. So basically, there was initially, let's say, a world of software, and then a physical world. And then in the recent years, of course, the digital space started. And basically, the digital space is moving to, of course, expand into the physical world with all the key players that we all know very well. So just to mention, this very famous sentence by Bill Gates: banking is necessary, banks not. So the real issue here is how banks can really work in this world with the fintechs in order to overtake the challenges that are in the market at the moment. The real driver for this change is the e-commerce. Basically, is the e-commerce that is the real engine for this global revolution, and is the e-commerce that is the key interest of the big players, both in the US and China. So if we look, for instance, at the growth of the e-commerce in the last few years, you see that now we have reached more or less $3.6 trillion in value. And if you think that, for instance, just to mention Italy as a GDP that's more or less is around this size, so 1.9 trillion. You can easily see that this amount starts to be really amazing. Consider that the largest Chinese bank, ICBC, has a total assets of around 3.5 trillion. So now the volume is already above that. But more importantly, the percentage of global commerce which is transacted through e-commerce is still negligible, more or less around 2%. So in terms of growth and potential growth, this is huge, and that of course can have an immense impact on driving a cashless behavior. And basically the giants are the Chinese, who are taking the largest part of the e-commerce, Alibaba and Tencent and the others, while the Americans are, of course, have a large share, but already smaller than the Chinese volumes with Amazon, Facebook, and Google and Apple. That's why, of course, in the recent years, the tech companies have become basically the largest ones in terms of market cap. If we look at the investments, this morning we mentioned several times, for instance, the importance in R&D, artificial intelligence, and so on. And that is another striking message, in the sense that if you look at the annual investments in R&D for the big techs, you see that the volumes are from Amazon, $60 billion, down to Facebook at around 7. And if you compare these investments with the banks, you see the largest and the most innovative, or at least aggressive bank in terms of investments is JP Morgan, with around $1 billion in value yearly, while the average European bank, for instance, is around a tenth of that. So even more, if you sum up the first six top, technology companies, you see that the top six of them are basically 50% investing more than the 500 largest bank. So this is really a real threat to the banks, and the banks, of course, have to cope with this kind of scenario. Let's look now where the gate is. And this is a chart that has been reworked, starting from a McKinsey study. If we look at the global revenue pool for banks, which is around $3.7 billion, and we think about mapping across the different market segments, retail, mid-corporate, and large, and the key processes, payment, lending, deposit, and markets, you see that about 50%, 49, is in retail. So what has been happening in the last few years is basically this kind of journey. Everything, as we said, starting with the e-commerce, starting from payments. And the e-commerce, of course, is interested in developing this. The first move was, in particular in China, was to think about moving to lending. As long as the player had a good customer base, a good pool of users, which basically is the key driver. The next move was to move to lending in terms of expanding into another profitable way of making money, since they had a very good control over the consumer base. But in order to lend, of course, you need to have the cash and the deposit. So they started to open also pure online banks, in particular in China, to really fund the lending. And as a last step, a move to markets, market meaning the investments for retail and again, users. So this kind of journey is what is happening with the large, huge Chinese giants that are really, competing in a banking market, even though they don't want to be a bank, but they are doing that as an instrument to develop their business in other areas. So if we look first at the American players, these of course are very well-known players. I just like to mention what's going on in WhatsApp, for instance, in India after the new regulations on corruption. So due to that, in India is really booming the usage of WhatsApp as a instrument to make payment transactions, while Google instead doesn't have e-commerce per se, but invested a lot in fintechs. And then the real two more active players, apart from PayPal, that was basically the innovator at the beginning, is Amazon, with about 350 million wallets already in place that are doing transactions, and now they are thinking about also having a lending arm. But as you see, in US, all the key players are focused on payments. In China, instead, their approach is much more integrated. If we look at the key players are here, Ant Financial, meaning the financial arm of Alibaba, Tencent with their e-commerce arm, eBank, this is an innovative Chinese bank, and then Baidu, Xiaohui, and 360. And we consider what they're doing, the key services. We see that basically they are, active on all the portfolio of products and services, sometimes reaching already some levels that are astonishing. Alibaba, in the payment service, they've already reached a volume of $900 billion, which basically is 3 times as much as what PayPal is doing. So in a very short term, actually, if we think about what's happening in the last 10 years, basically. More than that, they're also creative in terms of providing completely new solutions. So Alibaba, Tencent, and the e-bank started to a new startup, a new insurance, online insurance from scratch, which is basically the largest online insurance in the world, investing $8 billion. And all of them are putting real money on the table. If you look at the volume of the acquisitions that they did in the past 5 years, is something in the range of the tens and tens of billion dollars. Therefore, they are very, very active also in investing in new startups. If we look closer to the 2 key players in China, Alibaba and Tencent, I just mentioned about all the services that they are present, so very diversified portfolio. I like to mention 3 of them. One is Alipay, which is basically Ant Financial, that now is the largest payment online. My Bank, which is a lending bank created from scratch for consumer financing. And Yuanbao, which is basically the largest fund to collect deposit and invest deposit in monetary instruments, even larger than, let's say, basically ING Direct. So you can have an idea that even though, again, Alibaba is not a bank, but they are really doing banking services quite heavily and aggressively. And Tencent, more or less, is the same. Tencent is playing with 900 million users, and they started with the social, with QQ, from social and entertainment, that basically were a game, online game platform. They moved to utilities and payment again. So the idea is that their asset is the number of users. Having such a huge number of users, they can have a very large, started to have a growing share in the e-commerce, and basically about 300 plus million users just doing online payments. So coming back to your question, when you think that cash will be out of the market, well, it depends how fast these guys will be, because again, it could be in a matter of a few days or sometimes even earlier. Difficult to say. But what is, I think, is important is that from a geographical perspective, you see that big guys in America and in China, of course, are competing fiercely on their homelands respectively, attacking each other on their homelands. They, of course, are moving to Europe. Europe, apart from very nice exceptions, rather is still an old continent in the sense that is moving less, or at least not as fast as clearly these giants. But more importantly, I think we all are very interested in what will be happening here in the Gulf. The Gulf is a very interesting area. From a certain perspective, does not have the huge number of population and therefore potential users as other countries like India, for instance, apart from China, or even Africa later on. But of course, there's a huge amount of wealth. So again, it would be interesting to see if Gulf will be a place where only local players will be, playing each other, or if there will be enough potential to attract also the competition from overseas. Okay? So that is overall, very quickly, an overall picture about what's going on in technical side and in technology side. Here, by the way, it's a MoneyGram mentioned that we discussed this morning. This acquisition and financial tried to acquire MoneyGram, but Trump, blocked it. Let's move a little bit to the fintech world. Try to see what's going on. The key, facts that are in the fintech. If we look at the recent years, you see this very nice, phenomenon, which is basically a huge growth in terms of both investments and number of fintechs that have been created. And the peak was around 2014, 2015. Then all of a sudden, there was quite a dramatic decline due to two key factors. One is that having had such a huge number of fintechs up front, of course, most of the processes, functionalities, and so on were covered. And second, having so many fintechs around in the same space, more or less, the potential for return and, of course, the return on investment was not that attractive. So also investors started to invest a little bit less and more cautiously. In any case, if we look at the number of fintechs existing in the world, this number comes from Medici. So Niccolo is the provider of this number, 27 more or less 1,000 fintechs around the world as an estimate. And we see the distribution around the countries. Again, China is taking over about 1/3, less than 1/3 in the US, and then the rest of the world. So again, that means that China is, anyhow, is very strong also in nurturing the innovation from the very scratch. If we look at the payback of these fintechs, and then we just look at the unicorns, for instance, even though China has less unicorns than the US, but in terms of market cap, it's by far the largest share, about a little bit less than $100 billion. And what is important also to see is the level of participation of financial institutions in these deals. The banks are starting to be more and more involved, also in investing in the fintechs. It's interesting to just mention one of the most active European banks, which is BBVA. Their CEO and chairman, Francisco Gonzalez, started to say since 2015, BBVA will be a software company. So to have a CEO of a bank making this statement is quite amazing. In terms of coverage, the fintechs basically are covering all the key functions and processes in the banking domain, but you see that in terms of growth, the red ones are the, let's say, most dynamic areas. Apart from InsurTech, you see here that in insurance, everything started a little bit later than in banking, but the real growth comes from the newest services and functions. While, of course, in the payment, we have already about 1,500 fintech focused just on payments. So again, here I think what is most likely will be a consolidation or a sort of selection of the key players. Payments has been already very well covered. That is in terms of landscape. Let's consider now what could be the, let's say, partnership between a fintech and the bank. So we said that basically banks are under a major pressure and potential attack from the big giants in technology and e-commerce. Fintech can be, quite an important support to help the bank to overcome this threat. So first message is that fintech and banks should play like a football team. You have the defense and center that basically is made of the bank's capabilities. So the core systems, the size, the organization, customer base, and so on. But of course, the front line, the attack, should be in the, under the control of the fintech, meaning to have the fintech exactly ready to do the key, functions and roles in this game. In order to have such a football team play well, of course you need a good coach. And again, here is just a comment about how you can evaluate and see a coach and the team as well. if you put together two different, very different bodies, fintech and banks, from a cultural point of view, you might have a stronger crash because the banks could look at the fintech from an industrial perspective. So focusing primarily on the strategic fit, or for instance on the feasibility and time frame. So the focus would be on the business coherence. But for the fintech, and therefore for a startup, the focus is completely different. You look at first the entrepreneur, the capability to develop innovation, and to the team expertise, and to the track record. So again, you need somebody to support the bank and the fintech to play together. Otherwise, this liaison is not going to work, effectively. And you reach this, let's say, team up between fintech and a bank through typically a journey that starts from the initial evaluation of fintech. So you should select basically which fintech could be interesting, apart from considering the possibility of doing the development in-house. Then, of course, you move to a business case and the buy-in, internal buy-in, down until, of course, the system integration, in order to ensure that the fintech and the bank can really act together and take the most from their union. Just to give you an example, this could be, an idea of how a portfolio fintech could be managed, and how the bank could go through a selection on fintechs. This is just, for instance, a mapping of some of the startups that we are Supernova are, following up. You see basically a mapping considering the impact on the solution of the IT banks, so the complexity and the risks involved in adopting this fintech, vis-a-vis distribution of cost, service, and revenue, so meaning where the fintech are really impacted. So there are fintech that are focused on increasing the revenues, others that are looking primarily on the service side, so improving the customer experience, for instance. Others that instead are focusing on reducing the cost. So you can have an idea that moving around this portfolio is not that easy. So you really need to approach that quite in a comprehensive way, starting from understanding what are the banking needs. So let's move to the last point, which is where to go between competition or collaboration. And I think a summary could be this one. If you think of a journey between, starting from a low digital maturity to a high maturity, considering the banks between specialized and universal banks, you can start thinking about different banks, more or less plotted in a way that you say the small banks and Champions Bank, more or less around this line, with some challenger banks that are, from one reason, either they are new banks that maybe they've been created scratch from online, or that from historical reasons are on the front line of innovation. If you think about Champions Bank, for instance, we have the key major European banks, some of them. A good example could be, again, BBVA, for instance, that in the last years is thinking about investing $1.4 billion in innovation. Then you have the fintech. The fintech companies basically can be an instrument to move towards really a global player in the cashless world, in the payment system, or not only in the payment system, but in lending and basically in deposit, trying to cope with the competition that comes from the big giants, American ones, and the Chinese. And just as a quick mention, as Supernova, we did exactly this. We work basically working with the financial institutions to provide, advisory and consulting services as Innovation Hub, as implementing tailored solutions. But at the same time, we advise FinTech in terms of marketing their concept, and also with investors that can be interested in picking up the right FinTech in the market. Having so many FinTechs around, this is an important and challenging kind of process. These are just some few names of the FinTech that we're working with and the digital companies that are providing multiple services. So that's from my side. Thank you so much. And